The station was already breaking when I reached triage 4. I heard it first, a deep, structural groan that traveled through the deck plating and into my boots, the kind of sound that means load-bearing members have failed somewhere below, and the rest of the architecture is deciding whether to follow. I had been a trauma surgeon aboard the UNMS Resolve for 11 years, and I had heard that sound exactly twice before. Once on a mining platform above Ganymede, where a reactor shield had cracked, and the scaffolding around it began to fold, and once in a collapsing field hospital in the Corsian system, where an orbital strike had fractured the building's foundation while we were still operating inside it. Both times, the structure had made its decision within minutes. The sound is the warning. What comes after is gravity. I pushed through the emergency seal into triage 4 and stopped. 43 Dorvathi were on the deck. Some were on stretchers, improvised ones, made from cargo netting and bent conduit ribs, lashed together with electrical cabling stripped from the walls, and some were on the bare floor, arranged in rough rows by a triage system I did not recognize. Their skin was slate gray and semi-translucent, threaded with veins of pale violet bioluminescence that pulsed in rhythms I would later learn corresponded to their cardiac cycles. Where they were injured, the bioluminescence dimmed to a dull indigo, and where they were dying, it went dark entirely. A slow fade from violet to nothing, like embers cooling in the dark. The ones whose veins had gone dark lay motionless, their six-fingered hands curled inward, their wide oval eyes still open but filmed with a membrane that had turned opaque. The air smelled wrong, a chemical sharpness undercut by something organic and sweet, like overripe fruit mixed with heated polymer. I recognized the polymer, structural adhesive from the station's internal bracing, aerosolized by heat when the cascade failure had superheated the adhesive bonds in the lower ring. The sweetness I did not recognize. I would learn later that it was a Dorvathi stress hormone called vethilar, exuded through the pores of the skin when the body entered crisis. The concentration in the air told me, before any scan or briefing, that every Dorvathi in this compartment had been in biochemical crisis for hours. The entire chamber was saturated with it. A Dorvathi female stood at the center of the compartment. She was tall, 7 feet, perhaps 7'2", with the broad-shouldered, narrow-waisted build that I would come to understand was characteristic of their engineering caste. Her skin was darker than the patient's, a deep charcoal gray that absorbed the emergency lighting and gave her silhouette a solidity that the others lacked, and the bioluminescent veins running along her forearms and up the sides of her neck pulsed with a steady amber rhythm that seemed deliberate, controlled, like a pulse she was choosing to maintain by willpower alone. She wore a torn station uniform, dark green thermoweave with a shoulder insignia I could not read, and her hands were covered in a substance that looked like dried resin, cracked and flaking at the knuckles where the material had been applied in layers and had begun to degrade. She was holding a child. The child was small, maybe 3 feet, curled against the female's chest with its face pressed into the hollow of her collarbone. Its bioluminescence was faint, a threadbare flicker of lavender that came and went with each shallow breath, each pulse slightly weaker than the one before. One of its arms hung at an angle that told me from across the room that the elbow joint was shattered, not broken, shattered, the Dorvathi equivalent of a comminuted fracture where the ceramic calcium composite that formed their skeletal structure had fragmented into multiple pieces under impact. The female looked at me. Her eyes were large, deep-set, the color of polished obsidian, and they held an expression I had seen on 1,000 faces in 1,000 triage bays across half a dozen systems. Not hope, not despair. Something between the two, the look of a person who has been holding a line alone for so long that the arrival of help does not immediately register as real. The mind protects itself by refusing to believe too quickly. I have seen that look on human faces. Seeing it on a face that was not human, that was gray and angular and lit from within by fading light, did not make it less recognizable. It made it more. I'm Commander Kira Vasquez, I said. UNMS Resolve Terran Medical Corps. I'm a surgeon. I'm here to help. She stared at me for 3 full seconds. Then she said something in Dorvathi that my translator rendered as, "The station is failing. We have 412 wounded. 61 are critical. I have been sorting them for 19 hours. 19 hours. I looked at her hands again. The dried resin was surgical sealant, their equivalent of field dressing compound, applied by hand to wound after wound for the better part of a day. She had been triaging and treating alone for 19 hours with nothing but station-grade sealant, and whatever equipment had survived the cascade failure. No other medical personnel. No relief. No help incoming as far as she had known, until the moment I walked through that seal. I keyed my comm. Vasquez to Resolve. I need the full surgical complement in Triage 4. All teams. And I need a structural assessment of this compartment. I'm hearing load-bearing failure below us, consistent with primary girder compromise in the lower ring. Captain Torres responded in 4 seconds. Vasquez, structural confirms the lower ring is compromised. Seismic readings show progressive failure in the primary support grid. You have maybe 90 minutes before the floor you're standing on loses its last redundant load path. I'm sending 1st and 2nd Surgical, plus Engineering Team Bravo for emergency shoring. The Dunkirk is docking at Port 7 with additional medical supplies and a portable xenobiology suite. We'll have a 2nd shuttle of personnel from the Caraway within 20 minutes. 90 minutes. 412 wounded, 61 critical, on a floor that was going to drop out from under us in an hour and a half. I turned to the Dorvathi female. What is your name? Overseer Teth Valori, Station Primasketh Engineering Division. Overseer Valori, I need you to walk me through your triage tags. I need to understand your system so my teams can integrate with it when they arrive. We have 6 minutes before my 1st surgical team comes through that seal, and I want to be fluent in your system by then. She looked at me with that expression, the one caught between believing and not believing, and then she nodded once, transferred the child to a Dorvathi civilian who materialized from the row of walking wounded as though summoned by instinct, and began to explain. The Dorvathi triage system used bioluminescent markers, patches of compound applied to the patient's sternum that monitored the cardiac rhythm through skin contact and shifted color based on metabolic state. Amber meant stable, flickering violet meant declining, dark meant dying or dead. The system was elegant, more elegant than ours, frankly, because it provided continuous real-time status without requiring a human observer to check vitals at intervals. The patches did the watching for you. It was also failing, because the compound had a shelf life of 12 hours under normal environmental conditions, and the station's environmental systems had been offline for 22 hours. The temperature had dropped to 4 degrees Celsius. The atmospheric mix had shifted as the recyclers failed. Under those conditions, the patches were degrading, losing their color accuracy, their monitoring sensitivity drifting, and some of the patients tagged as stable were not stable at all. Their patches had simply stopped updating. How long since your environmental systems failed? I asked. 22 hours. The primary coolant loop ruptured during the initial cascade. We lost thermal regulation first, then atmospheric recycling. The current air is being supplied by emergency reserves that were rated for 6 hours of operation. You've been on emergency air for 22 hours. I sealed non-essential compartments and redirected the reserve feeds into the occupied sections. I rerouted the backup ventilation system through the cargo ducts, which are not designed for atmospheric distribution, but which provide adequate volume if the flow rate is manually regulated. I have been regulating it. She paused. I am an engineer. She said it the way an engineer says it, flat, factual, with the implicit message that the solution was obvious, and the only reason it required explanation was that I was not an engineer. I liked her immediately. My first surgical team came through the seal 6 minutes after my call, exactly on schedule. Lieutenant Commander Priya Okonkwo, my deputy chief surgeon, a woman built like a distance runner, all angles and controlled energy, with hands so steady I had once watched her suture a ruptured spleen during a 3G evasive combat maneuver without missing a single stitch. Behind her came 4 surgical nurses, 2 anesthesia technicians, and a field trauma kit that weighed 80 kilograms and contained supplies for 100 procedures across 6 known alien physiologies, and 1 catch-all protocol for unknowns. "Talk to me," Priya said, already scanning the compartment with the practiced sweep of a surgeon who has walked into mass casualty events before and knows that the first 30 seconds of visual assessment are worth more than any briefing. "Fort 12 wounded, 61 critical, species we've never treated. Their triage patches are degrading. We need to resort everyone from scratch. Floors going out in 83 minutes. We work fast or we work in freefall." Priya didn't blink. She turned to her team. "Standard mass casualty protocol, modified for an alien physiology we've never seen before today. Scan first, sort second, treat third. Nobody touches a patient until we've confirmed what baseline vitals look like for this species. Sanchez, get me a physiological reference from the ship's xenobiology database. Everything we have on the Dorvathi, even if it's a stub entry from an initial contact file. I want to know what normal looks like before I start guessing." Nurse First Class Maria Sanchez was already on her datapad, pulling records. What she found was thin. The Dorvathi had been a spacefaring species for less than 2 centuries. They occupied a single system on the far edge of the Galactic Accord's mapped territories, and their medical data in the Accord's shared species database amounted to a single entry. A physiological overview submitted during their initial membership application 47 years ago, written in Dorvathi scientific notation that had never been fully translated into any standard medical reference format. "I can give you the basics," Overseer Valori said. She had been listening from 3 meters away, but she had heard everything. Dorvathi auditory sensitivity, I would learn, was roughly twice the range of human hearing. Dual circulatory system, primary hemolymph loop, and secondary bioluminescent loop. The bioluminescent loop carries nutrients to the dermal layer and regulates thermal exchange with the environment. If the bioluminescent loop fails, dermal tissue begins to necrotize within 3 hours. Our cardiac organ is a 6-chambered structure located behind the sternum, slightly left of center. Our respiratory system filters through gill plates in the thorax, not lungs. We are sensitive to particulate contamination, but tolerant of low oxygen concentrations. Blood coagulates slowly compared to most species in the Accord's medical database. Our clotting factor is thermally activated. It functions optimally at 38 to 42 degrees Celsius. Below that range, it degrades. Below 20 degrees, it essentially stops functioning. This station is currently at 4 degrees. She delivered the entire briefing in the same flat, engineering cast register, as though she were describing the operating specifications of a pump system rather than the architecture of her own species' bodies. It was the most useful 40 seconds of clinical data I had ever received in a field setting, and I have received clinical briefings on 6 worlds and 4 orbital stations. "Priya," I said, "you heard all of that. Warm environment aids clotting. Their people are bleeding out partly because they're cold. Can we get supplemental heating in here?" Engineering Team Bravo is 2 minutes out. I'll have them bring portable thermal units. We carry 6 in the emergency loadout. Do it, and tell the Resolve I need warmed saline, standard human IV saline, heated to 40 Celsius. We'll use it as a thermal medium even if we can't administer it intravenously. Pack it around the critical patients. Warm compresses against the torso, where the cardiac organ is. Their clotting factor is thermally activated. If we can raise core temperature even a few degrees, every wound in this room starts clotting better. Valori was watching me. Her obsidian eyes tracked the logic of what I was proposing, and I could see her processing it, an engineer's mind mapping a system's inputs and outputs. You are going to heat a fluid you cannot give them, and use it to warm them externally. Heat is heat. Your people need it. We'll figure out the biochemistry as we go. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You brought medical supplies for a species you have never treated before." "We brought supplies for whoever was in trouble. We adapt." Engineering Team Bravo arrived 90 seconds later, 8 people in heavy exoskeletal work rigs, carrying structural shoring beams, portable welding units, and the thermal generators I had requested. Bravo's team lead, Master Chief Fatu Diallo, took one look at the buckling floor plates and the cracked support columns visible through the gaps in the deck, and started giving orders before I could brief her. "We shore the main load bearers first, then the secondary transverse beams. Kovacs, Tanaka start on the port side columns, they're showing the most deflection. Park, Reeves, get those thermal units powered up and running, priority to the medical treatment area in the center of the compartment. The rest of you with me. We're going below to assess the next ring. If it's gone, we brace this level from the inside out and we do it fast." She said it all while pulling on her welding visor, her voice carrying the particular cadence of a senior NCO who has done this enough times that the procedure lives in her muscles rather than her memory. Within 4 minutes, the compartment was filled with the blue-white flash of structural welding and the rhythmic thud of shoring beams being hammered into load-bearing positions against the damaged columns. The Dorvathi watched. They watched from their stretchers and from the floor, and from the corners where the ambulatory wounded had pressed themselves against the walls to stay out of the way. They watched with those wide, obsidian eyes, their bioluminescent veins pulsing in patterns I was beginning to read. The ones pulsing faster were afraid, and the ones pulsing slowly were too weak to be afraid, and the ones whose veins had gone amber bright were watching with something that looked, across the divide of species, very much like wonder. I was sorting a row of 12 patients with Sanchez, rechecking each one against the degraded triage patches, correcting the status where the patches had stopped updating, when the first respiratory arrest happened. A Dorvathi male in the second row, older, his skin deeply creased along the brow and jawline, the veins along his arms almost completely dark. His gill plates stopped mid-cycle. No warning tremor, no gradual decline. They simply locked open in the position that meant the respiratory muscles had seized, and he stopped breathing. I dropped beside him. "Sanchez, the gill plates, what resets them?" "Unknown, Commander. We have no protocol for Dorvathi respiratory arrest." Valori was already there. She had crossed the compartment in 3 strides that covered ground faster than I would have thought possible for someone who had been on her feet for 19 hours straight. She knelt on the other side of the patient, pressed both palms flat against his thorax, and applied pressure in a rhythmic, circular pattern. Not the sharp vertical compressions of human CPR, but a rolling, wave-like motion that seemed designed to manually cycle the gill plate musculature from the outside, mimicking the neural signal that the cold had interrupted. The gill plates respond to external manipulation if the neural drive signal has failed, she said, not looking up, her hands moving in the steady 1-2-3 pattern. "Press here, against the lateral thoracic ridge, and here on the sternal plate. In sequence 1-2-3, the timing matters more than the force." I matched her movements. 1-2-3, press, roll, release. The gill plates flexed once, hitched, flexed again, a mechanical response, the tissue moving because we were moving it, not because the body had remembered how. On the 4th cycle, something caught. The muscles engaged on their own. The plates moved without our pressure, and the patient drew a rasping, shuddering breath that sounded like stiff paper being torn slowly in half. His bioluminescent veins flickered, a single pulse of dim violet, starting at his sternum and traveling outward along his arms in a wave that took 2 full seconds to reach his fingertips. Not strong, not stable, but present. You just taught me that in 10 seconds, I said to Valori. You learned it in 5. The rest was my explanation. I showed Priya the technique. Priya showed the 2 nearest nurses, demonstrating the hand position and the 1-2-3 rhythm on a cleared section of deck plating. Within 3 minutes, every human medic in the compartment had the gill plate reset in their hands. Over the next hour, we used it 11 more times, 11 respiratory arrests across the compartment as the cold continued to degrade neural function in the weakest patients. 11 arrests, 11 saves. A resuscitation technique that had existed only in one Dorvathi engineer's muscle memory was now replicated across 30 human pairs of hands, each pair adapting the movement to their own grip strength and their own sense of rhythm, but the result was the same every time. The gill plates caught, the patients breathed. Between the 7th and 8th arrest, the thermal units failed. Not all of them. 3 of the 6 portable generators that Engineering Team Bravo had positioned around the treatment area. A power surge from the station's dying electrical grid backfed through the conduit that Diallo's team had tapped for auxiliary power, and the surge protectors on 3 units tripped simultaneously. The compartment temperature, which had climbed from 4 degrees to a precarious 11 under the thermal unit's output, began falling again within seconds. I felt it in the air against my forearms where my surgical sleeves were rolled back, and I felt it in the hemolymph under my hands. The Dorvathi patient I was treating, a young female with a crushed thoracic plate, had been showing improved clotting response as the warmth reached her tissue. When the temperature dropped, I watched the clotting slow in real time. The hemolymph at the wound margins thinned from its coagulating viscosity back toward the consistency of heated copper, fluid, seeping, refusing to hold. Diallo, I called across the compartment. 3 thermals are down. I see it. Surge from the station grid, the conduit we tapped is carrying unstable current. Kovacs is on it. She was already moving, pulling a diagnostic scanner from her belt while jogging toward the power junction her team had installed. Give me 4 minutes. 4 minutes in a compartment full of patients whose blood would not clot without warmth might as well be 4 hours. I looked at Priya. Body heat, Priya said immediately. She had already thought of it. Priya always thought of the next thing before the current thing finished going wrong, which was why I had requested her for every deployment since our first rotation together on the hospital ship Mercy of Kyoto. Human core temperature averages 37 Celsius, within the Dorvathi optimal clotting range. We put our people against the critical patients, direct thermal contact. It was not a standard medical protocol. It was not in any manual. It was the kind of idea that comes from a mind trained to solve problems with whatever is in the room, and what was in the room was 32 human beings whose bodies ran at the exact temperature that Dorvathi biology needed to survive. I gave the order. Every human in the compartment who was not actively performing a procedure moved to the critical patients, the ones tagged darkest, the ones bleeding fastest, and pressed against them. Surgical nurses lay beside Dorvathi patients on the cold deck, wrapping arms around torsos, pressing palms flat against the sternum where the cardiac organ sat, sharing heat through direct skin contact. Marines who had been carrying stretchers knelt beside the wounded and held Dorvathi hands between their own, cupping the 6-fingered hands like small birds being warmed by a fire. Sanchez curled herself around a Dorvathi child, whose bioluminescence had faded to nearly nothing, a child no larger than a human 5-year-old, with down-soft gray skin and veins that barely flickered, and held it against her chest the way a mother holds a sick infant, her body curved around it like a shield. The Dorvathi who were conscious stared. Some of them made a sound, a low, harmonic vibration that resonated in the chest cavity, transmitted through the body contact to the humans holding them. My translator could not parse it. Valori, who had been working alongside Priya, resorting the degraded triage patches, looked up at the sound and went still. "What is that?" I asked her. "Kethura," she said. The The translator flagged the word as untranslatable and offered a semantic cluster: shelter, warmth, flock, trust. It is what our young say when they are held by their parents in the dark. It means, she paused. Her amber bioluminescence shifted briefly to a flicker of something deeper. It means I am not alone anymore. The child in Sanchez's arms was making that sound. A vibration so faint it was more felt than heard, transmitted through Sanchez's ribcage into her bones. And Sanchez, who had 2 children of her own on the UNMS Caraway, ages 3 and 7, who she had not seen in 4 months, held the Dorvathi child tighter and did not let go until Diallo restored the thermal units 3 minutes and 41 seconds later, and the temperature began climbing again, and the child's bioluminescence strengthened from a threadbare flicker to a steady, dim lavender glow. Sanchez set the child down on a warmed stretcher and checked its vitals against the color chart she had written on her wrist. Stable. She moved to the next patient without a word, and her face showed nothing except the flat, controlled expression of a professional who has work to do. But her hands were shaking slightly, and I pretended not to notice because some things are private even in triage. The second surgical team arrived 8 minutes after the first, led by Lieutenant Commander Chen Wei, a quiet, methodical surgeon whose clinical notes were the most precisely organized documents I had ever read, and whose hands, in an operating field, moved with the economy of someone who had never made an unnecessary cut. Behind Chen's team came the first shuttle from the UNMS Caraway, a hospital ship purpose-built for extended medical operations, with surgical theaters that could run 12 simultaneous procedures, and a xenobiology laboratory that had processed more alien physiologies than any civilian institution on Earth. The Caraway's team brought the one thing my people critically lacked: a portable xenobiological analysis unit that could sequence an unfamiliar species biochemistry in under 10 minutes and generate a compatible pharmaceutical protocol from the results. We need blood chemistry, I told Chen. Valori gave us the structural architecture of their physiology. Now I need molecular detail: what their hemolymph is made of, what their clotting cascade looks like at the protein level, what human pharmaceuticals will interact safely with Dorvathi biochemistry. The analysis unit runs on the first critical patient we can stabilize enough to draw clean samples from. Chen's team identified a candidate in 3 minutes. A young Dorvathi male with a penetrating abdominal wound that had been sealed with station adhesive by Valori's hand sometime in the past 19 hours. The adhesive was holding, but the tissue beneath it was dark, the bioluminescence completely absent in a radius around the wound, and his primary hemolymph loop was losing volume at a rate that would kill him within the hour. Chen drew the samples with a precision that bordered on ritual: 3 vials of copper-tinted fluid, each one handled like it was irreplaceable, which in a sense it was, because the data those vials contained was the key to treating every other patient in the station. The analysis unit processed the samples in 7 minutes. What it returned was a surprise and a gift. Dorvathi hemolymph was copper-based, structurally similar in certain respects to the blood of Terran horseshoe crabs, but built on a protein matrix that made it remarkably tolerant of foreign chemical compounds, a characteristic that their medical literature, if we had been able to read it, would have told us was an evolutionary adaptation to the mineral-rich atmosphere of their homeworld. Their clotting factor was, as Valori had described, thermally activated. It functioned optimally between 38 and 42 degrees Celsius, almost exactly the temperature range of the human body. And the finding that changed everything: their anaphylactic response pathways, the immune cascade that in most species would reject foreign medications, were neurologically suppressed during crisis states. In an emergency, their bodies became chemically permissive. They would accept help. "We can use modified human clotting agents," Chen reported, looking up from the analysis readout with the controlled expression of a scientist who has just found something extraordinary but will not allow excitement to compromise precision. Dose at 60% of human standard, administered warm. Their nociceptors respond to a compound structurally similar to our local anesthetics. I can synthesize a Dorvathi-compatible nerve block from our existing pharmaceutical stocks in 20 minutes. You have 15. The floor is running out of patience. Chen made it in 12. We worked. There is no other way to describe the next 90 minutes, and no poetry in it, and no narrative arc that captures what it is to perform triage surgery on an unfamiliar species in a compartment that is actively trying to collapse around you. You assess, you prioritize, you cut, you seal, you move to the next one. You do not think about the patient after this one while you are working on this one, and you do not think about the floor while you are working on any of them, because the floor is not your problem. The floor belongs to Diallo and her team, and you trust them the way you trust your own hands, because that is what the service teaches you. The person beside you has their assignment, and you have yours, and the aggregate of everyone executing their assignment is the difference between a rescue and a body count. I operated on 9 patients in the first 70 minutes. 3 abdominal penetrations sealed with the modified clotting compound Chen had synthesized, each one requiring a different approach, because Dorvathi abdominal anatomy is not standardized the way any textbook might suggest, and the organ placement varied between individuals in ways that meant I was mapping unfamiliar territory fresh each time I opened a wound. 2 thoracic crush injuries, where the gill plates had been partially collapsed by falling debris during the cascade, the delicate respiratory membranes compressed against the chest wall and beginning to fuse to the damaged tissue. Separating them required a precision I had never applied to any tissue this fragile, working with tools designed for a different species anatomy, adapting by feel. 1 complete amputation of a lower limb that had been trapped under a collapsed structural beam for 14 hours, the tissue beyond salvage, the limb cold and dark and still. The amputation was the hardest case I have ever worked. Dorvathi's skeletal structure is a ceramic calcium composite, lighter and harder than human bone, beautiful in cross-section, with a crystalline grain that catches light like polished stone. But it shatters instead of breaking cleanly, leaving jagged fragments that embed in surrounding tissue like shrapnel from an explosive device. And their blood vessels do not retract when severed. They lack the elastic contractile layer that causes human arteries to pull inward and partially self-seal after transection. Each severed vessel remains wide open, bleeding freely, and a single limb amputation exposes 6 major vascular channels that must each be individually clamped before the blood loss becomes unsurvivable. I clamped them one at a time while Priya held the stump in Valori, who had inserted herself into my surgical team without asking permission and without anyone thinking to identified each channel by its bioluminescent signature. "That one," she said, pointing to a channel pulsing faint blue-green. "Primary hemolymph supply. Clamp it first, it carries the highest volume flow." And the amber channel beside it. Bioluminescent nutrient loop. It can wait 30 seconds without consequence. The blue one cannot wait at all. I clamped the blue channel, the bleeding slowed. She pointed to the next. We worked through all 6 in under 2 minutes, the engineer reading the system, the surgeon clamping each line, and the stump went from a catastrophe to a controlled surgical field. The patient's veins, which had been dark across his entire body, flickered to a dim, unsteady violet. The remaining 3 of my 9 cases were bioluminescent loop failures. The secondary circulatory system had shut down in sections, and the dermal tissue was necrotizing, turning from translucent gray to opaque black in patches that spread like burns across the skin. I debrided dead tissue with a laser scalpel set to its lowest cutting width, exposing the intact layers beneath, then manually irrigated the secondary channels with warmed saline to restart flow. The channels were smaller than human capillaries, and each irrigation required a pressure calibration that I learned through feel. Too much and the channel wall ruptured, too little and the flow did not restart. I found the right pressure on the second patient and used it on the third without adjustment. The body learns. The hands remember. At the 57-minute mark, Diallo came up from below. Her face told me the report before her words did. "Commander, the ring below us is gone. Primary structural girders have sheared at 4 points across the circumference. We've braced this level, but the bracing is rated for static load only. If there's another cascade event, a secondary explosion, a coolant rupture, anything that introduces lateral force, the shoring fails and this compartment drops 3 decks into the debris field below. We'd lose everyone." "How long do the braces hold under static load?" 4 hours, maybe 5 with luck. After that, metal fatigue in the temporary beams begins to propagate and they lose load-bearing capacity. "We have 360 patients still on this deck." "I know, Commander. My recommendation is immediate evacuation to the docking ring. The Resolve's shuttle bay can take 100 at a time, and the Caraway is docked at Port 7 and can receive patients directly. But we move now. Every minute we stay is a minute closer to the static limit." I looked at Valori. She had heard every word. Dorvathi hearing does not allow for private conversations at normal speaking volume. Her bioluminescent veins were pulsing fast, the fear response I was learning to read. But her face held the same composed mask she had worn since I walked through the seal. "The docking ring is intact," she asked Diallo directly, one engineer to another. "Structurally sound. Your station's docking ring was built to military freight specifications, heavy margins, redundant load paths. It'll hold anything we put on it." "Then we move," Valori said. "I will direct my people. They will not panic if they see me walking." She said it as fact, and she was right. When she walked into the rows of wounded and began speaking calmly, steadily, her amber bioluminescence bright and controlled against the charcoal gray of her skin, the Dorvathi who could move began to rise. Parents lifted children. The ambulatory wounded supported those who could not stand alone. They formed lines, orderly and quiet, and followed Valori toward the corridor that led to the docking ring, and they did not panic, because she was walking and her light was steady, and that was enough. My teams carried the ones who could not walk. Stretcher by stretcher, gurney by gurney, a procession of surgical nurses and Marines and Dorvathi civilians moving through corridors that groaned and shifted beneath them. The deck plates vibrated under our feet with a continuous low tremor, the station's skeleton redistributing stress as we moved hundreds of bodies from one section to another. Diallo's engineers walked ahead of the column, checking each junction, bracing weak points with portable supports, marking unsafe passages with chemical light sticks that cast an amber glow that, by coincidence or by something I do not have a name for, was almost exactly the color of the Dorvathi comm signal. We lost the floor in Corridor 17. The sound came first, a sharp, metallic crack that echoed through the passage like a rifle shot, followed by the groaning shear of structural members giving way beneath us. The deck plates under the forward section of the column buckled downward, forming a V-shaped depression that dropped 2 meters before the emergency cross-bracing caught it. 3 stretchers slid into the depression. 6 Dorvathi patients and 2 of my surgical nurses went down with them. Nurse Tors, no relation to the captain, caught the edge of a wall bracket with one hand and a stretcher rail with the other, and held a Dorvathi child suspended over the gap for 11 seconds until Diallo's team could extend a shoring beam across and form a bridge. I counted those seconds because I was standing 4 meters away holding a patient who could not be jostled, and I could not help her, and I could not look away. Her arm was shaking by the 4th second and rigid by the 8th, and her knuckles were white against the bracket, and she did not let go. When they finally took the weight, she flexed her hand once, checked the child's bioluminescent readings against the back of her own wrist where she had written the color codes in surgical marker, and kept moving. Sanchez climbed into the depression and triaged the 6 patients who had fallen. 2 unchanged. Their injuries were positional, and the fall had not worsened them. 3 with new trauma, a dislocated upper limb, a reopened abdominal wound leaking hemolymph through the clotting compound we had applied 40 minutes earlier, a cracked gill plate housing venting with each breath. Sanchez resealed the abdomen with fresh compound, splinted the limb against a length of shoring material, and packed the gill plate fracture with surgical foam. All of it done kneeling in the bottom of a buckled corridor with emergency lighting and the sound of settling metal around her. The 6th patient was dead, a Dorvathi elder whose bioluminescent veins had been dark when we loaded her onto the stretcher, expectant category, beyond intervention, carried because we carried everyone. The fall had not killed her. She had died during the transit quietly, her 6-fingered hands curled inward the way the Dorvathi dead always seem to curl, as though reaching for something only they can see. Valori stopped. She stood over the stretcher for 3 seconds, I counted those too, and her bioluminescence shifted from the controlled amber she had been maintaining to a single, full-body pulse of deep indigo that started at her sternum and rolled outward to her fingertips like a slow wave. Then the amber came back, steady as before, and she turned and continued walking. We lost corridor 12 next. Not the floor this time, the ceiling. A ventilation trunk running the length of the corridor separated from its overhead brackets and dropped 4 meters onto the column of evacuating Dorvathi. The trunk was industrial grade, heavy alloy, 3 meters in diameter, carrying the emergency airflow that Valori had rigged 20 hours ago. It struck the column at the midpoint, pinning 8 patients beneath it, and the impact cracked the deck plating beneath them badly enough that the entire section sagged downward at a 15-degree angle, creating a slope that sent stretchers sliding toward the breach. Master Chief Diallo's engineers were there in seconds. Kovacs and Tanaka, the 2 structural specialists, braced the sagging section with portable jacks while Park and Reeves cut through the fallen trunk with plasma torches to free the trapped patients. The cutting took 6 minutes. 6 minutes during which the evacuation column had to halt, and the structural tremors beneath us grew more frequent, and the clock on Diallo's 90-minute estimate continued ticking down. I triaged the 8 trapped patients while the engineers cut. 3 were uninjured. The trunk had landed across their stretchers, but the stretcher frames had held, forming a cavity beneath the wreckage. 2 had new compression fractures in their thoracic plates, not immediately lethal but painful, their gill plates hitching with each breath as the cracked bone pressed inward. I stabilized them with pressure wraps improvised from surgical draping and moved on. 2 more had been knocked unconscious, concussive force from the impact transmitted through the deck, and their bioluminescent loops were flickering erratically, the neural regulation disrupted by the trauma. I administered the modified nerve stabilizer that Chen's team had synthesized, injecting it warm into the tissue alongside the secondary circulatory channels, and watched the flickering slow to something more rhythmic, more controlled. The 8th was Valori's child, the one she had been holding when I walked into triage 4, the small one with the shattered elbow and the fading bioluminescence. It had been placed on a stretcher and assigned to a civilian caretaker during the evacuation, and the trunk had struck the stretcher broadside. The child was alive. Its veins still flickered that threadbare lavender, but the impact had reopened the arm injury that Valori's station sealant had been holding closed for 20 hours. Hemolymph was flowing freely from the fracture site, the copper-tinted fluid pooling beneath the child's arm on the stretcher fabric, and without the thermal support of the treatment area's generators, the hemolymph was not clotting at all. Valori saw it from 3 meters away. She pushed through the column, not running, not panicking, moving with the deliberate, controlled stride of someone who has chosen not to break, and knelt beside the stretcher. Her hands were steady. Her face showed nothing. Her bioluminescence was amber, perfectly controlled, perfectly steady, and that control was the most frightening thing I had seen all day, because it meant She was holding herself together by force of will against a pressure that would have shattered anyone with less. "Hold the arm elevated," I told her. "Above the cardiac organ, slow the flow, I'll clamp." She held, I clamped. 2 channels, the same technique she had taught me during the amputation, the engineer reading the system while the surgeon closed it. The hemolymph slowed, stopped. I applied warm saline compresses from the emergency pack on my belt, the last 2 I had, and pressed them against the fracture site to coax the clotting factor into action. 30 seconds, 60. The hemolymph thickened, held. The child's bioluminescence strengthened. 1 shade, 2. A pulse of lavender that traveled from the arm up through the chest, faint but present, and the child opened its eyes, large, dark, filmed, and looked at Valori, and then at me. It said something. My translator caught it half a second later. Warm. Valori's amber control cracked for exactly 1 second. A single pulse of violet white, the weeping light I would learn about later, the one that meant grief and relief and gratitude fused into one frequency, rolled through her veins and vanished. Then the amber returned, and she picked up the child, and we kept moving. The docking ring held. Diallo had been right. It was overbuilt, the kind of structure that engineers design with margins that make budget committees file formal complaints, and that save lives when every other system has failed. The Resolve's shuttle bay absorbed the first 106 patients in 14 minutes. The Caraway, docked at Port 7, opened its main cargo bay and converted it into a complete ward in under 20 minutes, beds down from wall mounts, portable surgical suites positioned, atmospheric units calibrated to the Dorvathi gas mixture, thermal blankets warmed to 40 degrees. Captain Ajora Nwasu, the Caraway's chief medical officer, met the first stretchers at the airlock and began sorting patients into her system with the same flat, capable efficiency that Valori had used in hers. 2 triage systems, human and Dorvathi, clicking together like matched components. The 3rd ship arrived at the 94-minute mark. The UNMS Perseverance, a fleet tender, not a warship, not a hospital ship, but a repair vessel, the kind of ship that carries hull plating and welding equipment and replacement parts. Tours had called for her because the station needed more than surgeons. The station needed to stop dying. The Perseverance docked at the freight port and disgorged 120 repair technicians who spread through the damaged structure like white blood cells, moving toward an infection. They found the ruptured coolant conduit that had started the cascade and sealed it with molecular bonding compound that held at twice the original pressure rating. They found the failed power coupling and bypassed it with a portable fusion cell. They found the atmospheric recyclers that had been offline for 22 hours and replaced the contaminated filters with units from the Perseverance's own stores. A decision that left the tender running on reduced atmospheric recycling for her return trip, which her captain authorized without a pause. The Perseverance's chief engineer, Lieutenant Commander Yuki Ashiro, coordinated the repair teams with a methodology that bordered on surgical. She mapped the station's remaining structural integrity on a portable holographic display, identified the 7 systems whose failure would trigger a secondary cascade, and assigned teams to each one in order of criticality. Coolant loop first. Without it, the reactor shielding would overheat and force a shutdown, killing power to everything else. Power coupling second. The bypass she rigged used 3 portable fusion cells daisy, chained in a configuration that her own training manual explicitly warned against, but which she calculated would hold for 72 hours, long enough to fabricate a permanent replacement. Atmospheric recyclers third. The 4th system on her list was the station's structural monitoring network, the grid of sensors embedded in every load-bearing member that provided real-time data on stress, deflection, and fatigue. The network had been offline since the cascade, which meant Diallo's team had been bracing blind, guessing which members were about to fail based on visual inspection and the sound of the metal, the deep groaning that I had heard when I first entered, the sound that means the structure is talking to itself about its own mortality. Ashiro's team brought the monitoring network back online in 38 minutes, and the data it returned was a gift and a verdict. The sections we had already evacuated were minutes from collapse, confirming that Diallo's instinct to move immediately had saved every life in that column. The sections where the Perseverance's teams were now working had enough residual integrity to hold for the repair window. But the data also showed something Diallo had not detected by ear: a slow-propagating fracture in the station's primary ring girder, the single largest structural member in the facility, running along a path that would intersect the docking ring's anchor point in approximately 6 hours. If the fracture reached the anchor point, the docking ring, where all 400 of our patients now rested, would separate from the station. Ashiro looked at the data for 11 seconds. Then she said, "I need every welder on the Perseverance and every structural beam we can fabricate in 6 hours. We're going to pin that fracture." They pinned it. 47 welders working in teams of 4 along a fracture line that ran for 212 meters through the station's skeleton, laying down molecular bonding compound and carbon fiber reinforcement in overlapping patterns designed to arrest the crack propagation. They worked in partial vacuum. The section around the fracture had lost atmospheric integrity, wearing pressure suits and communicating by helmet radio, their welding arcs throwing blue-white light against the exposed girder surfaces in rhythms that, from the docking ring's observation windows, looked like a slow, deliberate pulse. The Dorvathi watched from those windows. They watched their station being rebuilt by strangers, one weld at a time, and their bioluminescence shifted in patterns I was learning to read but could not yet name. Within 2 hours of the Perseverance's arrival, Station Primusketh had atmosphere again. Warm, clean, circulating atmosphere. The temperature in the habitable sections rose from 4 degrees to 29. In the surgical bays where my teams were still operating, the effect was immediate and visible. Dorvathi clotting factors activated across every open wound simultaneously. Bleeding slowed in every patient in the treatment area at once, as though a single switch had been turned. The bioluminescent loops in their skin began to strengthen, veins brightening from dim threads, to visible, steady pulses of color that spread across their bodies, the way light spreads across water at dawn. I was elbow-deep in a Dorvathi chest cavity when the warmth reached us, repairing a torn gill plate membrane in a female patient whose respiratory function had been declining for hours. The membrane was gossamer thin, translucent, threaded with capillaries so fine they were nearly invisible. I was stitching the torn edges together under magnification with ophthalmic gauge sutures, the smallest we carried, while Priya held the gill plate open with human-sized retractors that were slightly too large for Dorvathi anatomy. When the temperature rose, I felt it before I saw it. The tissue under my fingers firmed. The capillaries filled with hemolymph that caught the surgical light with a faint blue-green sheen. The patient's bioluminescent veins, dark across her entire thorax, flickered once, twice, and then steadied into a pale violet glow that spread outward from the repair site like a ripple across still water. "She's stabilizing," Priya said quietly. I finished the sutures, tied off, stepped back. Her gill plates moved, a shallow, hitching breath, then a deeper one, then a rhythm that steadied and held. Her bioluminescence brightened along her arms, her neck, her face. Her eyes opened, obsidian, filmed, confused, and she looked at me. At my human face, the surgical mask around my chin, the blue-green blood on my gloves. She said something my translator caught a half-second late. "You are warm." I said, "You're going to be all right." Her eyes closed. The rhythm in her veins settled into the slow, steady amber that I now recognized as the Dorvathi signal for safe. At the 4-hour mark, a 4th ship arrived, unannounced, unscheduled, responding to a relay of our distress intercept that had propagated through 3 comm stations before reaching an open Terran frequency. The UNMS Quiet Meridian, a deep space survey vessel, whose captain had diverted from a cartographic mapping assignment 3 systems away, because she heard the call on an open channel and decided, without orders, without authorization, without any protocol that justified the deviation, that someone needed to be there. The quiet Meridian carried no surgical suites, no repair equipment, no military stores. She carried cargo space, crew quarters with working life support, and a galley that could feed 300 people. Her captain, Commander Lena Park, opened every cabin on her ship to Dorvathi refugees and had her crew prepare meals from the nutritional profile our xenobiology unit had compiled. The meals were approximations, human rations recombined to match Dorvathi caloric and mineral needs. They were not Dorvathi food. They were not good, but they were warm, and they were offered by people who had crossed 3 systems to offer them, and the Dorvathi ate and wept. I did not see the weeping. Valori told me about it afterward, in the quiet hours after the station was stabilized. She told me the Dorvathi do not weep with tears. Their eyes are not constructed for it. They weep with light, a specific bioluminescent pattern, rapid, chaotic flicker of deep violet and white that runs from the chest outward to the extremities, broadcasts a signal that their species reads as grief and relief and gratitude fused into a single expression that has no separation between the 3. When the quiet Meridian's crew served the first warm meals and the refugees began to eat, the cargo bay filled with that light. 117 Dorvathi, flickering violet and white, their bodies broadcasting something that needed no translation because it was not a word. It was a frequency. The crew of the quiet Meridian stood at the edges of the cargo bay and watched in silence. Commander Park found me afterward on the Resolve's observation deck. She was a small woman with close-cropped silver hair and the weathered hands of someone who had spent 20 years gripping a command chair through maneuvers that most navigators would call inadvisable. She had brought her ship 3 systems and diverted from a year-long mapping assignment because she heard a frequency that meant someone was dying, and she had nothing to offer except space and warmth and food, and she had offered it anyway. "I don't have a medical bay," she said, as though apologizing. "You had a galley," I told her, "and cabins with working life support, and a crew that cooked meals for 300 strangers. Approximations of meals. Warm approximations. That's what they needed." She was quiet for a moment, looking out the observation port at Station Primasketh, its damaged silhouette lit by the running lights of the 4 Terran ships now docked along its surviving ring. Then she said, "I wasn't ordered here." "I know. I'll probably get a formal reprimand for abandoning the survey assignment." "Probably. Worth it." I looked at her, she looked at me. Neither of us smiled, because there was nothing to smile about. 407 people were alive who had been dying 12 hours ago, and 5 were not. And the station was holding together with borrowed welds and borrowed air. And every person in the relief operation was exhausted past the point where exhaustion registers as a feeling and becomes instead a texture in the bones. But something passed between us in that look, the recognition that we had both done the thing we were supposed to do, not because anyone ordered it, but because the call came and we went. The final count, 412 Dorvathi wounded treated across 3 triage bays and 4 ships. 61 critical cases stabilized. 39 surgical procedures completed, 6 amputations, 11 gill plate reconstructions, 22 bioluminescent loop restorations. 5 dead, 4 who had died before we arrived, their loops already dark when I walked into Triage 4, and the elder in Corridor 17, who left us quietly during the evacuation. Every patient who was alive when we reached them stayed alive. Station Primasketh's Governing Council sent a formal communication to Terran Command 18 days after the evacuation. 3 pages in engineering cast register, every repair cataloged, every patient listed by name and outcome, every human crew member identified by name and rank, every metric quantified to the decimal. tonnage of supplies consumed, kilowatt-hours of power provided, cubic meters of atmosphere generated, caloric value of meals served aboard the quiet meridian. At the end, after all the numbers and the engineering precision, there was a single line. Tors told me it had been written by Valori herself, in a register the translator flagged as archaic, a mode of Dorvathi speech reserved for debts that cannot be quantified. The translation read, 407 of our people breathe today because yours chose to be warm. I have thought about that line more than I should admit. Whether she meant the thermal units, or the warmed saline, or the heated atmosphere that restarted her people's clotting factors. Or whether she meant something larger, something about the nature of a species that crossed empty space to kneel beside strangers and learn the architecture of an unfamiliar body so they could keep it alive. I think she meant all of it. My name is Commander Kira Vasquez, UNMS Resolve, Terran Medical Corps. I am filing this addendum to the official after-action report, case designation TRC 4419 Primusketh, because the official report contains the numbers and the timelines and the procedural annotations, and those are necessary and correct, and they are not enough. They do not contain the look on Valori's face when she understood we were real. They do not contain the sound of a child breathing after its gill plates were repaired by a surgeon who had never seen a gill plate before that morning. They do not contain the light in a cargo bay when 117 people wept without tears, and a crew of strangers stood at the edges and understood without a single word exchanged. This report is the light. I am filing it because someone should know that on the 22nd day of Terran Standard November, 4 human ships answered a distress call from a species they had never met, on a station they had never visited, in a system that was not their corridor and not their mandate and not their obligation. They brought surgeons and engineers and repair crews and warmed blankets and food that was not good but was warm. They learned a species physiology in 7 minutes and synthesized compatible medicine in 12. And taught themselves a resuscitation technique in 5 seconds, and rebuilt a failing station while operating on its inhabitants at the same time. 4 ships, 263 people, 9 hours on a station that was trying to die. 407 lives held in the balance. 407 still breathing. That is the number, it is enough.